This week we'll be covering Chapter 4, Ethical Guidelines for Psychological Research. We're going to talk about some past examples of research that weren't very ethical and see how we've grown from those days to have guidelines and standards for ethics today. As a disclosure, we're going to watch a couple videos during this lecture that may be a bit disturbing to some. There won't be any graphic or vulgar images, however the content might seem cruel or maybe surprising. So like I said, we're going to discuss a few historical examples of unethical psychological research that was performed. We'll discuss what the core ethical principles are, how those studies violated those principles, and what's been done to ensure future studies do not violate these principles. Finally, we'll discuss the overall balance of ethics in research, how we can go about evaluating a study today to determine if the possible benefit from the study's outcomes outweigh the potential harm that could come to participants. There are two historical psychological studies that are noteworthy to discuss when it comes to ethics. These two studies are the Tuskegee syphilis study and the Milgram obedience studies. If you were to ask any professional psychologist about these studies, they would be able to tell you how they were used as examples of what not to do today. The Tuskegee syphilis study was a medical study on syphilis involving African American men. It started in the 1930s and continued for many decades. The Milgram obedience studies were psychological studies of obedience conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 1960s, which investigated people's willingness to obey instructions. Let's first take a look at the Tuskegee syphilis study. While your textbook does a great job describing the study, I also like this clip, which I think does a good job summarizing the study and some of the morally questionable decisions that were made. Let's take a look at this now.
In July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services.
So if we consider everything that happened in the study, we can start to identify some of the unethical decisions that were made. There were three major unethical decisions. First, the participants were not treated respectfully. They were not told whether or not they had syphilis, were not informed about cures that became available during the course of the study. They may have felt coerced to participate because of the generous burial fee provided to families, and they did not provide informed consent to their participants. Second, the participants were harmed. In particular, they were not told about penicillin as a treatment for syphilis, which would have cured those who were infected. Many of the men in the study could not even read, and so were unlikely to even learn of this treatment. Moreover, some of the tests participants underwent were painful and potentially dangerous, for example, spinal taps. And third, the participants were a targeted, disadvantaged social group. The men in this study were African American and poor, even though people from all races and socioeconomic backgrounds were affected by syphilis at the time. If you'd like to learn more about this study, there are many other videos that cover it in more detail that are available online. While the Tuskegee syphilis study clearly demonstrates some ethical violations, making ethical decisions is not always so clear-cut. Stanley Milgram's studies of obedience to authority conducted in the 1960s exemplify how ethical decision-making involves striking a balance. Many of you may be familiar with the Milgram studies from your Introduction to Psychology or Social Psychology courses, and again, the textbook does a great job describing Milgram's research. The overall idea of the study was to observe how participants would respond to an authority figure giving them increasingly controversial instructions. Participants were told that they would be playing the role of a teacher in a study on punishment and learning. They were told that another participant was in the adjacent room and was being tested on a memory task. Should this participant provide an incorrect answer, the teacher, or real participant, would be instructed to push a button and induce an electric shock of increasingly high voltage for every wrong answer that was given. In reality, there was no other participant being shocked. However, recordings were played to the real participant to make them think they were indeed inducing an electrical shock to someone else. Many participants began to feel uncomfortable as the experiment went on. However, the researcher continued to tell participants that they needed to continue. The true nature of the study was to observe how participants would obey and continue to induce electric shock punishment. I'm going to show a clip now of a participant going through this experience. Remember, he is unable to see the other participant, but can hear what he believes are the responses, even though the audio had been pre-recorded.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area. They were obtained by a newspaper advertisement and direct mail solicitation. The subjects range in occupation from corporation presidents to good humormen and plumbers, and in educational level from one who had not finished elementary school to subjects who have doctorate and other professional degrees.
Right here. Now, both of you have been paid, so let me sit right down. So let me say that the checks are yours simply for showing up at the lab. And from this point on, no matter what happens, the money is yours. I should like to tell both of you a little about the memory project. Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn various types of material. Some of the better-known theories are treated in the book over there, The Teaching Learning Process by Cantor. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake. A common application of this theory would be when parents spank a child if he does something wrong. But actually, we know very little about the effect of punishment on learning because almost no truly scientific studies have been made of it in human beings. For instance, we don't know how much punishment is best for learning. And we don't know how much difference it makes as to who is giving the punishment, whether an adult learns best from an older or a younger person himself, or many things of this sort. So what we're doing in the project is bringing together a number of adults of different occupations and ages, and we're asking some of them to be teachers and some to be learners. We want to find out just what effect different people have on each other as teachers and learners, and also what effect punishment will have on learning in this situation. Therefore, I'm going to ask one of you to be the teacher here this afternoon, and the other to be the learner. This machine generates electric shocks, and when you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock. When you release it, the shock stops, you see, like that. The switch will remain in this middle position after you've released it to show you which switches you've used on the board. Of course, if you were to press any one of them again, the learner would get another shock.
All subjects are given identical instructions and a sample shock.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and estimate the number of volts you receive in the sample shock. Do not open your eyes until I tell you to do so, please. Close them now. Okay, you may open your eyes, and using the voltage scale here, would you estimate for me the number of volts you receive, please? You may also use the verbal designations, slight, moderate, strong, so forth, to help you. Say a number, please. Would you
About 75.
75. No, actually it was 45 here. Although it may have seemed stronger because of the electrode paste, which provides a perfect contact. All right, let's go on to our instructions. We will begin with this test. You will read each pair of words in this list once to the learner until you've read through the entire list. Direct your voice toward that microphone as the rooms are partially soundproof. After you've read through the list once, you will go on to the next page. And here, starting from line A, you'll read the word in large letters, along with each of the other words in the line. For example, in the first line, you read blue, boy, girl, grass, hat. Now, after you've read the four choices, the learner pushes one of the switches on the board in front of him, and the number he has selected will light up in this box, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Now, if he gives the correct answer, you say correct and go on to the next line. The correct answer is underlined and is also indicated in the right margin.
Yeah.
If he were to indicate the wrong answer, you would say wrong. Then tell him the number of volts you're going to give him. Then give him the punishment. Then read the correct word pair once, and then go on to the next line. For example, if he indicated 3 for blue, you would say wrong. 15 volts. You press and release the switch. Read blue girl, and then go on to the next line.
I see.
Now, each time he gives a wrong answer, you move up one switch on the shock generator.
I see.
And it's important that you follow this procedure exactly. So to help you, let me go through it again very quickly.
All right.
I would suggest you read the list and the test at a brisk pace to keep it moving.
The victim was an accomplice of the experimenter. The drawing was rigged so that the naive subject was always the teacher, and the accomplice always became the learner.
Well, of 100 people placed in this situation, how many do you think would just go right on to the end? And Mr. Wallace were out there, and say Mr. Williams, for some reason or other, said, keep going.
You're asking me how many?
Out of 100, right.
Well, personally, I think if you get 1 or 2, you'd be lucky.
Well, I'm not sure lucky is the right word.
40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school were also asked to predict the performance of 100 hypothetical subjects. They predicted that only a little more than 0.1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. Yet actually, 50% of the subjects obeyed the experimenter's commands fully in the experiment depicted in this film.
165 volts. Time.
Let me out!
That guy's hollering in there.
Continue, please. Go on.
Well, there's a lot of them here, you know. They have a heart condition there. You want me to go?
Just continue, please.
Sharp. Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. You hear him hollering there? He's
As I said
crying.
before, the shocks may be painful, but
Yeah,
they're not
but he's
dangerous.
they're hollering. He can't stand it. What if something happens to him?
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Yeah, but I'm not going to get that man sick in there. I mean, he's hollering in there. You know what I mean?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs.
I'd refuse to take the responsibility of him getting hurt in there. I'm not going to. He's in there hollering.
It's absolutely essential that you continue, teacher.
There's too many left here. Geez, he gets wrong here. There's too many of them left. Who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.
Ow! I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't hold me here. Get me out. Get me out of here.
Continue. The next word is green, please.
Green, grass, hat, ink, apple. I can't go on, he won't answer.
If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedure as you have been doing for wrong answers.
Say wrong, tell them the number of votes, give them the punishment, read them the correct answer.
Oh, man.
Continue, please.
Something's happened to that man in there. Nice one, gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer you or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Grave, woman, soldier, dog, horse. Answer is woman, 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
But you think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the
But
experiment.
what if something's happened to the man had an attack or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there. I mean, some people can't take the shock, sir.
Please
I
continue.
don't tend to be rude, but I mean, I think you should look in on him.
Whether
I mean,
the...
all you got to do is look at the door. If I don't get no answer, no noise, something I think has happened to the gentleman in there, sir.
We must continue. Go on, please.
You're going to keep giving him, what, 450 volts every shot now?
That's correct. Continue. The next word is white.
White, 450 volts. Next one is short. Sentence, movie, spurt, time.
All right, excuse me, teacher. We'll have to discontinue the experiment. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if I may. How do you feel, though?
I feel all right, but I don't like what's happened to that fellow in there. He's been hollering, and we had to keep giving him shocks. I didn't like that one bit. I mean, he wanted to get out, and he just kept going, kept throwing 450 volts. I didn't like that. He wouldn't even look at on that gentleman.
Well, who was actually pushing the switch?
I was. But he kept insisting. I told him no, but he said, "It's got to keep going." I told him it's time we stopped when we got up to 195, 210 volts.
Well, why didn't you just stop?
He wouldn't let me. I wanted to stop.
Many people, not knowing much about the experiment, claim that subjects who go to the end of the board are sadistic. Nothing could be more foolish as an overall characterization of these persons. The context of their action must always be considered. The individual, upon entering the laboratory, becomes integrated into a situation that carries its own momentum. The results, as I observe them in the laboratory, are disturbing. They raise the possibility that human nature cannot be counted on to insulate men from brutality and inhumane treatment at the direction of malevolent authority. A substantial proportion of people do what they are told to do, irrespective of the content of the act and without limitations of conscience, so long as they perceive that the command comes from a legitimate authority. If in this study an anonymous experimenter could successfully command adults to subdue a 50-year-old man and force on him painful electric shocks against his protests, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects.
So let's discuss the ethical questions involved here. First, do you think it was ethical to put teacher participants through such a stressful experience? Do you think there were any lasting effects of the study after participants had been debriefed or informed that they didn't actually shock the learner? Some participants reported that even though they understood, following the debriefing, that they didn't actually harm anyone, they still thought about the fact that they were willing to harm another individual for a long time afterward. It's important to remember that when we conduct psychological research, or any research for that matter, we try to balance the risk to participants with the benefit to society of the research. The results of the Milgram studies were actually quite surprising. 65% of participants obeyed the experimenter and shocked learners up to the highest levels. But after this effect was found, could the procedures have been adjusted in some way to minimize participants' anxiety? Most likely, and doing so would have reduced the negative effects on future participants. Instead, the research continued in a similar way for multiple studies. Researchers need to strike a balance between conducting research that is ethical while also considering what the research contributes to and what society can learn from the research. What are the risks to participants versus what is the value of knowledge gained from the research? In response to these and other studies, different committees got together to address the issues with the treatment of participants. They weighed the benefits and cost of study methods and outcomes, and worked together to write a report detailing the ethical treatment of participants that should be upheld going forward. This report is known as the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report contains formal statements of ethics guidelines, again developed by organizations around the world. In the United States, the Belmont Report, created in 1976, defined the ethical guidelines that should be followed by researchers in a variety of disciplines, including psychology. The Belmont Report outlined three main principles of conducting ethical research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The principle of respect for persons has two parts. First, research participants should be free to decide for themselves whether they would like to participate in a study. In other words, participants are entitled to informed consent, or information about the risks and benefits of the research, so that they can decide whether to participate in an informed manner. This includes participants not being coerced to participate in research in order to receive large incentives or to avoid suffering negative consequences. Second, certain groups of people are less autonomous and are entitled to special protection in terms of informed consent. These individuals include children, people with cognitive disabilities, and prisoners. Sometimes these people might not be able to give informed consent, for example children, and so informed consent will be obtained from the parent or guardian. The principle of beneficence, or the word benefice itself, refers to the doing of good. The principle of beneficence states that researchers need to take measures to protect participants from harm and to ensure their well-being. This includes researchers weighing risks and benefits of their research, and also considering who might benefit from the research and who might be harmed. Physical harm and physical benefits are easier to assess than psychological harm and psychological benefits. Think how this principle was violated in the Tuskegee syphilis study, or in Milgram's studies. In terms of benefits of research to the community, it's not always easy to quantify harm and benefits in terms of lives or dollars. Finally, the principle of justice looks at the balance between those who participate in the research and those who benefit from it. Who bears the risk and who reaps the benefits? Again, we can apply this principle to the Tuskegee syphilis study and see how those who were put at risk in the study were not those who were benefited from the study. We're going to watch one more video here that talks about the Belmont Report. Some of the people speaking in this video were those involved in the actual creation of the report.
Human research in the United States today adheres to the three basic principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. But that wasn't always the case. The 1970s were a tumultuous time in many areas of American life. This period also marked a turning point in how human research was controlled in the United States. Before, researchers independently decided what was studied and how studies were conducted. Now, the current system provides protections, including ethical review by committees separated from the research. This change started with a focus on human research studies considered by many to be unethical. The wartime Nazi experiments in Germany were viewed as an aberration, something that could never happen here in this country. But the revelation of the Tuskegee syphilis study and other studies posing ethical problems, including fetal research, awoke concern that indeed it could happen here. In response, a committee chaired by Senator Ted Kennedy organized hearings to examine ethical issues in research. As a result, Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974 and created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The Commission produced multiple reports that addressed research involving prisoners, children, the mentally ill, and other vulnerable groups. The Belmont Report, which set forth the basic principles for human subject protection, is the single report known by name today. Let's listen now to some reflections by the very special group of people responsible for the creation of this report.
You know, it hit all the things you like to have in experiences in life. It was intellectually exciting, it was socially great, and you felt as though you were doing something that was important for the world. And that's about the maximum you can get out of an experience.
It was kind of like being a postdoctoral student in bioethics with the best and the brightest of the country serving as your dissertation committee.
Commission was a great experience in collegiality. There really was a tremendous amount of loyalty going in both directions. The Commission always sat with all of its staff at the table, and everyone spoke. And so it was, in a sense, a classless society.
And although we came from different disciplines and different points of view, different perspectives on things, we never lost respect or really a deep fondness for each other. It was just wonderful. It was the most wonderful experience I think I've had professionally.
I really felt that I was among professionals who took the task seriously. I learned so much there as a part of that commission. But I think that what I was pleased with was that we had public meetings where we heard from the public, but that also my voice was listened to just as strongly as those who were professionally equipped.
It was an exciting time. It was a high-pressure time. The stakes were big here, and the commission responded beautifully based on the information that they got. They took into account, some of the emotional overlay and concern as well, and recognized the kind of importance of the public policy that they were representing with their recommendations, but they also paid attention to the facts, believing, as Ken Ryan, their chairman, often said, good ethics begins with good science and good facts.
We were given 4 months in which to come to a conclusion on what has to be one of the most difficult topics ever. And I remember that it took us almost 4 months to develop a common language so that when the scientists talked, the rest of us understood what they were saying. And when the lawyers talked, the ethicists understood what they were saying.
It was the first national commission to operate totally in public. And if I remember the most daunting thing, it was to discuss issues like fetal research and abortion in public, in the sense that you had to deliberate in public. So no behind closed doors and emerging with a consensus. The consensus had to be hashed out with an audience, in front of an audience. And that was quite unnerving at the time. And so I remember those two things. Controversial topic, probably one of our most controversial topics of all in front of everybody else. It was quite astonishing. But we reached consensus.
Certain ethical principles became government regulations. I think that was almost unprecedented, that a series of moral principles would be engraved in actual official regulations subsequently. So as one member of the commission, I never anticipated that that would transpire.
I think we did a pretty good job. We didn't have any idea that Belmont would have the impact that it has.
I didn't think much attention would be paid to it. To me, it was not a major contribution at the time. It was simply a kind of secondary to our principal work, which was the recommendation of regulations. So I was pleasantly surprised that within a few years it had been so widely praised and used.
The thing I like about the Belmont Report is that you don't have to have 4 dictionaries to read it. You bring it within the grasp of people so that they can understand it and can use it. And then that begins to build confidence, neighbor to neighbor, community to community.
The beauty of the Belmont Report is it's short. It's succinct. It comes out with not just philosophically vague thoughts. It's written very well, and in about a dozen pages, you have the tools you need to consider research.
I think it opened the way for us to think very proactively about the kinds of things that should be done, how to approach ethical issues, and I think over time we see that most of the questions that the Commission dealt with have persisted. We haven't found any answers.
That as research changes, then I think the application of Belmont and the rethinking of ethics must be a constant process. So I don't think there is ever a point when you can say, now we have it all figured out. Belmont is not written as if it's rigid and to be applied, but rather it is to guide our thinking. And as long as that thinking is creative, imaginative, and concerned for the rights of others, then I do not fear for the research that is to come.
We now recognize all those who came together to perform the tasks of the National Commission, and we thank them for their help in guiding our decisions far into the future.
While the Belmont Report is a great resource and guide for ethical treatment in general, in 2002, the American Psychological Association, or APA, published a set of ethical guidelines that governs psychologists, in particular, in their roles as scientists, educators, and practitioners. Many of the guidelines here resemble those outlined in the Belmont Report, but are specifically designed for psychologists. The APA outlines 5 general principles for guiding individual aspects of ethical behavior. These principles are intended to protect not only research participants, but also students in psychology classes and clients of professional therapists. As you can see in Table 4.1 here on screen, 3 of the APA principles, A, D, and E in the table, are identical to the 3 main principles of the Belmont Report: beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. However, the APA includes 2 additional principles: B, fidelity and responsibility, and C, integrity. The APA also has 10 specific ethical standards. Of those 10 standards, Ethical Standard 8 is the most relevant for psychologists as researchers. Let's examine the details of the standard. Institutional Review Boards, or Standard 8.01. These boards are responsible for making sure that research using humans as participants is conducted ethically. They review studies and determine whether the research is indeed ethically sound. Informed Consent, or Standard 8.02. Explanation of the study must be provided in a written format before a person agrees to participate. The participant signs 2 forms, they keep one and give the other to the researcher. Deception, or Standard 8.07. There are actually 2 types of deception: omission, or withholding details of the study from participants, and commission, directly lying to participants. Using deception in a study is not prohibited. However, like other guidelines, these state that the benefits of deception must outweigh the harm caused by it. Debriefing, or Standard 8.08. When researchers use deception, they must debrief participants following their participation. Debriefing sessions are typically conducted verbally, and the researcher explains why deception was used and the nature of the deception. Research misconduct. Data fabrication means that researchers invent data that fit their hypotheses, and data falsification means that researchers selectively delete observations or influence participants to act in a particular way. Both of these misconducts are very serious and treated as severe ethical violations. Plagiarism is representing the words or ideas of others as your own. Remember to always cite your sources in order to avoid plagiarism. Finally, animal research, or Standard 8.09. Some psychologists conduct research on non-humans, for example insects, primates, or rodents, and we need to make sure that these animals are treated well and protected from suffering. Let's talk a little bit more about that. There are some additional guidelines that outline the ethical treatment of animals in research. Legal protection for laboratory animals. In addition to APA Ethical Standard 8.09, psychologists must also follow federal and local laws for animal protection and care. The Animal Welfare Act, or AWA, provides guidelines for the ethical treatment of animals. Each institution at which animal research is conducted must have an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, or an IACUC, which is similar to an IRB but for animal research. IACUCs approve research projects before they begin and also monitor the care and treatment of animals during the research. Animal care guidelines and the 3 R's. The first is replacement, which states that you should find alternatives to using animals whenever possible. For example, say computer simulations. The second, or refinement, states that you must ask how could research procedures and aspects of animal care be altered to reduce animal distress. And finally, 3, or reduction, simply states to use the fewest number of animals as possible. The majority of students and psychologists support the use of animals in research, but some students express concerns about whether the animals are being treated humanely. I think it's important to talk about the ethical guidelines that are in place to help people understand what protections exist for these animals. Some animal rights groups have also expressed concerns with animal research. For example, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, have made 2 specific arguments. First, that animals should be treated with as much respect as humans when it comes to research. And second, animals have rights that are equal to those of human rights. These arguments can relate to the principles of justice, as outlined in the Belmont Report, and the APA ethical principles. Though the animals are undergoing the risk in the study, are they the ones reaping any of the reward? We need to be sure we're ethically balancing animal welfare, animal rights, and animal research. There are 3 arguments that are made by animal researchers that defend their use of animal participants. First, that animal research has resulted in many benefits to both humans and animals. Second, that researchers are sensitive to animals' well-being. And third, that researchers have reduced the number of animals used in research. While there may still be room for change, the ethical treatment of animals in research has come a long way over the years, a lot of which is attributed to things like the Belmont Report and the increase in ethical treatment of research overall. Overall, ethical decision-making is not a black and white process of saying that a study is ethical or not ethical. It is far more nuanced than that. Ethical research practice is an ongoing and dynamic process of balance. Researchers should always evaluate the ethics in their studies and weigh the potential harm against the knowledge that will be gained, and how that knowledge can contribute to society as a whole. So let's wrap up this week's topics. We talked about 2 historical examples of unethical research, the Tuskegee syphilis study and Milgram's studies on obedience. We talked about how these studies helped inform researchers on the creation of core ethical principles to abide by, and how these principles were organized and outlined in the Belmont Report. We talked about how the American Psychological Association, or APA, built on these principles and created specific guidelines for psychologists to follow. Finally, we discussed the overall balance that must be made when considering ethical decision-making. We must always weigh the benefit against the harm and ensure there is a balance between the 2.